So, have you ever felt like your boss just does not see you accurately? Like, you know what you bring, and you know how much you think through and how much you carry or contribute. Maybe you prevent problems from even occurring, or you catch details, and there are people that you support, and you uphold standards of not only your own but of the company. Yet somehow that's not what's being reflected back to you. Like, you're being seen as less strategic than you actually are. Maybe less capable, or not quite ready, or less confident. In any case, less visible, right? And that gap between how you really are being in your workplace and how you're being seen, that can be so maddening. Because internally, you know who you are, but externally, that's not what seems to be landing. So by the end of this clip, you're going to understand why that gap happens, what's actually shaping how people perceive you, and how to close that gap. Like, without performing or trying to prove yourself or becoming someone you really aren't. Okay? Hi, I'm Leezá Steindorf. I'm an international leadership coach and facilitator, and I work with professionals who really are ready to align how they are experienced with the outside of themselves with who they really are. And if this is happening to you, there's nothing wrong with you at all. We're going to work through how it happens, what's going on. And if you find this content useful, go ahead and subscribe. You'll find out when other clips drop, because these conversations, they build on top of one another. Okay? So, I'm going to be direct. Most people think that recognition comes from being capable. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It doesn't. At least not all on its own, right? Recognition comes from capability being visible, like being seen in a consistent and an observable way. And that is different. So you can be deeply capable and still be misread. And you can be thoughtful and maybe still appear to be hesitant, or maybe you are very responsible, but you appear passive, right? And as I said earlier, you could be super strategic and still sound tactically if you only report tasks, right? So you can be holding a lot and still be perceived as not taking ownership, because no one sees the thinking behind what you're doing. And that's frustrating. Like, who wants that, right? If you're doing the work, you want it to be seen. So that's workable, because perception is it's not something that happens to you. It is partially co-created. Not fully, okay? So, and there's no blame here. Don't feel blamed. But it's great when we know that we actually have impact on circumstances, that we can do something. So, and I don't want to be naive, bias absolutely exists. Yeah, there is bad management, that's real. And some environments literally do not see people clearly. It does not matter how well they show up. I've worked in a lot of organizations, for a lot of organizations like that. But in many cases, there's still something that you or the individual can work with, can influence, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about. So the first question is, why does it feel so painful to not be seen accurately? Yeah, that discomfort, where does that come from? Because being misread, it touches something deeper. It's not just professional, it can be very personal. And you know your internal reality, right? You know your effort, you know your intention, you know how much you really care about what you do. So when someone responds to you as if you're less than all of that, it can really feel kind of unjust, if you will. Like, what the heck, right? And sometimes it is. But here's what the difficult part is. Other people do not have access to your internal reality. I'm going to say that again. People out there can't read what's going inside of yourself. They have access to what they repeatedly experience from you from the outside, right? What you say, what you show them, the things that you name, how you follow through on things, what you bring forward or what you don't share, right? Those are the things that form the picture. And that's what they have to go on. So if the picture they're forming is inaccurate, the question is not only why don't they see me, but there's also the question, what am I making visible? And what am I not making visible? Okay? And that question is not blame. There's never any blame or judgment in what I'm sharing with you. It's really, with the intention to help you clarify so you can be more powerful in your world. And that's pretty powerful. What am I making visible and what am I not? Because if you only stay in the they don't see me mode, right? You can become resentful or withdrawn or maybe even quit your job. But if you ask, what are they consistently experiencing from me? Then you have the power to do something. You've got something then to work with. Does that make sense? So a big part of my work is separating fact from filter, right? If you've listened to any of my content, you'll know that. So let's talk about that, separating the fact out from the meaning that you give it. So for example, fact, your boss has not recognized a contribution, right? You did something, accomplished something, no word was said. The meaning, though, that you may give it is, they don't value me. The fact you weren't chosen for an opportunity, a raise, team lead, whatever it is, your meaning, they don't think I'm capable. Fact, they give someone else visibility or they acknowledge someone else. Your meaning, I'm invisible here or I don't count. So maybe those meanings are accurate, partially or not. Maybe they're not accurate at all. But what happens is you actually take action as though those meanings were facts. So before you build your whole response to your meanings, slow it down. That's my invitation to you, okay? Because if you speak or behave from the meaning, you may begin to actually reinforce the very perception that you're seeking to change. So for example, if you're meaning or you've decided they don't value me, that's a belief you're holding. You may withdraw and stop offering ideas or only doing what's asked of you, like only executing just exactly what's being told to you. You may become more cold to colleagues or kind of flat or less engaged. And then what are they experiencing, right? They're experiencing less engagement, less presence, or less ownership and less initiative. So now that gap that was there in the first place gets bigger, okay? Or you may go the other way. You may start to overprove and overexplain and try harder and perform more, right? So you may try and make every contribution visible. And then that may be very intense. And then that's what they experience, pressure and need and maybe insecurity, right? And in any case, then the gap widens again between what's going on inside yourself and what's being perceived. So this is why clean perception work matters. Because, and let me just explain what I mean by the word clean, that there's not a lot of stuff attached to it. You reduce it down, really, you distill it down to just what matters. Because if you respond from your injuries or past history or your meanings, then you may create even more distortion. So, how do we get out of that? Here's the reframe. What if being seen is not about proving who you are? What if it's about making the value that you bring, your worth, observable? Just that. Not performative, just observable. And there's a difference, okay? Because performing says, please notice me. And observable says, here's what I'm seeing. This is what I'm doing. Here's what matters from my perspective. Or here's what changed because of this work. That's it. Observational. It's clean, it's grounded, and it's professional. Yeah? So that helps people, I'm going to say, see your thinking, see your internal processes more clearly and accurately. And that's especially important for people who are very quiet or do things quietly, right? That aren't direct and overt. You can still speak that cleanly, yeah? So there are those quiet stabilizers, let's say, the people that are not always out in the forefront. That's one way to be seen. The one who prevents the fires before anyone knows there's dangers, right? Who smooth out the process and who think ahead and kind of absorb complexity and try and simplify it, who really care about quality, but yet they're not overt about it. It's not seen. It just kind of gives this stable foundation. Those contributions often stay invisible unless you learn to name them. And that's not being boastful. It's not being proud and pompous at all. It's being precise. So, for example, you might say, I want to flag the risk that I'm seeing before it becomes a problem. And then state whatever it is you see. Or, here's the thinking behind this approach that I'm recommending. And then explain how you got there and why you think it's a good idea. Or, the outcome of this was not just that we completed it, it reduced confusion across the team. So you're, again, observing outcomes, results, actions. Or, I handled this directly so it didn't escalate. And that, again, that's not boasting. You're simply stating what is and informing other people. Yeah? It's making your reality visible. And many professionals, especially those who were taught to be humble and useful and easy to work with, right? Just agree and don't say anything, or not take up too much space. Those are the professionals that need to learn this, especially because silence does not always read as humility. It can also read as lack of ownership or lack of caring. And that may not be fair, right? You may be feeling totally different, but that's not what's being read on the outside. So this is often how workplaces function. So what happens when you stop assuming that they should already see it? It's a question. What happens then? When you start communicating in a way that people can track your thinking and your actions, like you kind of pop up on the radar screen, if you will, and you stop expecting people to mind read. That's fair. How can they know? So you're supporting them to see you. Maybe is a simple way of saying it. You stop resenting people for not knowing what you never showed. Like your boss, remember as we started, who can't see who you are, you need to give them more data, more information. And you begin building a reputation through that repeated experience. And that's key, repetition. It's not built from one situation or one time that you showed up and you did something. It's built from repetition. And the people repeatedly experience you as clear, and you consistently share your ideas. Doesn't have to be grandiose, as I said, but grounded and responsible and thoughtful and direct. And you'll start being seen as someone who sees around the corners and who people can rely on, people who owns what's yours, yeah? And especially someone who communicates before the confusion spreads, because if you're doing that work anyway, speak it. And over time, that becomes your reputation. And it's not because you announced your reputation, it's because you embodied it consistently enough that other people couldn't miss it any longer. They just couldn't. They just had to see who you are because that's what you kept bringing forward. Yeah, does that make sense? So what do? First, you make your thinking visible. How do you do that? Well, we have words, right? So you don't only deliver the result, which is amazing, but you name the process behind the result. I chose this approach because, you name it. The risk that I considered was, and you name that. The trade-off here in doing it this way as opposed to that way is, or this matters because, and you couch it in the values or the objectives of the project, yeah? So you are actually educating people on how you think. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that communicate outcomes, not just your effort. Yeah, your effort matters, but outcomes actually shape how people perceive things, right? So instead of only saying, I worked on this, you can say, this helped move the project forward by whatever it did. It clarified, this reduced costs, doing it this way created teamwork, or this approach prevented whatever it is. So help people make connections between what action was taken or decision and what the result was. And you are not exaggerating. You're actually connecting your work to your impact. Okay? And then the third thing is take ownership out loud. Yeah? And this is a tough one. I know it can be. So some people own things silently. Like they carry that responsibility internally and never make it explicit. Say it. I'll take lead on that. Yeah? Or I see the issue and I'll get back with some options on that. Yeah. Or I can own the next step. Yeah. Speak things out loud. I'll make sure this doesn't fall through. Like, you take ownership. Now people know you're the one to look to. And that kind of language, it really shapes how people experience you. Okay. And the fourth thing is align your words, actions, and follow through. So it's really taking it all the way to the end. And that's where your reputation becomes solid. Do what you say what it is that you see, and then follow through, especially with what you've promised, without needing to be chased. And if something changes, right, timeline, ability, resources, input, whatever it is, communicate that immediately, right? So when you're consistent, you exemplify authority, internal authority. And that's not being perfect, it's being consistent. And people can come to rely on that. Okay? One more piece. Sometimes your boss does not see you because you're still seeing yourself through an older version of yourself. Yeah, that means you haven't updated your internal vision of yourself. You may have grown and become more capable, and you may embody that authority now. But your behavior may still be calibrated to an earlier version of yourself where you had to be careful or get approval or be agreeable or stay invisible, right? So you need to internally update that vision of yourself, like internally know that you have changed and evolved into who you are now. So even if you know it inside, you have to then externally start behaving that way. You may be externally operating from that older system. So once you update that vision of yourself, you start acting from that place. So now there's one more piece. Sometimes your boss does not see you because you're still seeing yourself through an older version of yourself. You have not updated your internal picture of yourself. Like you've grown, you've become more capable, and maybe you do now embody that authority. But your behavior is still calibrated to that earlier version where you had to be careful or were still seeking approval or had to be agreeable or maybe even stay invisible, as we talked about, right? So you know internally that you've changed, but externally you may still be behaving from that old setting, all right? And there's no judgment or blame in that. It might be a truth that's not too fun to look at, but it's freeing because you can update that vision of yourself, and then your behavior will also update, right? You can let the outside match the inside. It's what I call authenticity, being congruent inside and out, okay? So the anchor is this. People do not respond to who you are in your head. They respond to who they repeatedly experience you to be out there, in your actions, in your presence, in your engagement. So make your value visible. Know what you bring to the table and bring it forth in a visible way. Not loud or pompous, just clear and direct. Give it a try and leave some comments in the chat box, okay? So if this helped you figure out how you can show up better as the person you know yourself to be, go ahead and subscribe because you'll know when new clips come out, and share with someone else who's really tired of being misread at work, okay? And in this series next, we're going to look at why you say yes when you actually mean no, and how to disagree without creating unnecessary conflict. Okay? All right. Thanks for listening. Till next time, be well.